Man, I was going to play some games, but all I've got is this Nintendo SNES. I mean, it's pretty good, but, just got not much interesting to it. I mean, it plays some pretty decent games, I won't lie. It's got Mario Kart, it's got normal Mario, it's got Zelda, it's got some Kirby games on it too, but it's just kind of boring, you know? I want my consoles to have something interesting and unique about them. I want them to do something weird. I got it! I'll add a weird and possibly useless gimmick to my console that could either make it fail miserably or make it one of the best consoles of all time. Let's get into it! Gimmicks and consoles. Two things that go hand in hand, even though often they shouldn't. Since the beginning of time, there's been some form of gimmick to go along with some form of console. In the early days, you have consoles like the Virtual Boy, which had their gimmick of, well, being really terrible VR. And in a modern sense, while the console gimmick has died out to a certain degree, it still does exist and still hangs around. Something like the Nintendo Switch 2 still has a gimmick of disconnecting controllers from the console and having a console be both a handheld and a normal home console as well. But gimmicks didn't start with the Switch 2, as I said. These went all the way back to the Virtual Boy. And there is another notable boy console that has an interesting gimmick to it. The Game Boy Light. You see, at the time, Nintendo was pretty big on the handheld market. You see, no one else was really able to crack into the handheld market like Nintendo was able to. Nintendo had cornered the entire section of the gaming industry for handhelds, and so they had a monopoly over it. And they wanted to increase their money gain in that monopoly. And so they experimented with improving their handhelds. You see, at the time, Nintendo was making the Nintendo Game Boy, one of the most well-known handhelds to man. I'm sorry, what's your name? Oh, Mr. Game Boy! Oh, sorry, I didn't recognize you for a second there. I thought you were a DS. The original Nintendo Game Boy did incredibly well, and so Nintendo, in an effort to try and upgrade it, wanted to fix one of the major problems of the Game Boy. You couldn't use it at night. You see, if you were trying to play your Game Boy while it was dark, well, you're not going to be able to get very far with that. You see, the problem with the Game Boy is that it doesn't have a backlit screen, so anything you're doing with the Game Boy, you can't see really. You can't see what you're doing if you're playing at night. You gotta play under some sort of light source to illuminate the screen so you can actually see what you're playing. And, well, the Game Boy didn't have its own lit up screen. And so Nintendo, because of this, decided to make the Game Boy Light an answer to the lack of light in the Game Boy. You see, the Game Boy Light, as its name entails, well, it adds light to the Game Boy. Instead of it just being a dull, traditional Game Boy screen, it adds a little switch that allows you to turn on a light on the Game Boy. Now, it's not a very powerful or good light, however, in the dark, it does help. Listen, I've done a decent bit of testing with the Game Boy Light and the original Game Boy, and I can say that the Game Boy Light's light does definitely help in dark areas. It allows you to see the screen when traditionally you wouldn't be able to. And you might be thinking, well, I've never even heard of a Game Boy Light. What is this guy talking about? Well, that's because you're not Japanese. You see, the Game Boy Light was launched exclusively in Japan. And so because of that, it's not the most common of consoles. It's actually a pretty rare Nintendo console, and to get one, you pretty much have to get one off of eBay somewhere and hope you can get a decent price for it. I got a decent price for mine. I managed to even snag a box with it as well, and original manual, so I got a really good deal. However, the Game Boy Light as a console itself, alright I guess. Its gimmick was the light, and the light really does feel a bit more like a gimmick here. While it does help in the dark situations, it's not that good of a light. It's not as good as something later that Nintendo would introduce, like with the Game Boy SP or even the later SP version, then eventually the DS. The backlight in the Game Boy Light is like barely noticeable. The backlight in the Game Boy Light just barely lights up enough for you to be able to see the screen at night, and while it does work, it is definitely very gimmicky. It does feel like it was just kind of thrown in there last second without too much thought. It was like they took a normal Game Boy, just kind of vaguely tried to make it light up, and that was it. They didn't try too far after that. However, like a lot of gimmicks, the Game Boy Light did prove to be almost a beta test. You see, with gimmicks, particularly with Nintendo as well, gimmicks tend to be kind of beta tests for future features. For example, the Game Boy Light, while it wasn't an amazing backlight, it did prove as a little test that backlights could be put in consoles, and eventually with the GBASP, well, they proved that they could do it. Nintendo put the backlight in the GBASP and it actually worked pretty damn well. However, the Game Boy Light wasn't the only gimmick console to exist. There was a whole heaping load of others. For example, one of the Game Boy Light's great-great-grandchildren, the Nintendo DS. The Nintendo DS had an interesting gimmick with it. It had two screens. The top screen and the bottom screen. The top screen on the Nintendo DS is used for, well, your general gameplay, but the bottom screen was an interactive touch screen that you could use with the Nintendo DS's stylus. I mean, you could use anything else, but you were supposed to use it with a stylus, really. The touch screen allowed you to add some extra features to different games, and it made gameplay on the DS actually pretty interesting. It shook things up slightly, and sometimes the bottom screen would just add a little bit extra information. Sometimes you could use it for actually interacting with things, and sometimes it was just for like inventory management. For example, in New Super Mario Bros., you can use the bottom screen to click on it and then you grab up an item that you've saved since previously in the game. In Animal Crossing, you could use it to be able to move your character around, I believe, sort of around your inventory. And in Mario Kart DS, well, it just has a mini-map. It proved, however, to be relatively useful. Having a second screen on the console actually wasn't the most useless gimmick idea ever, and while at the time it was a gimmick because, I mean, it was the first iteration of it, but look at this thing. This is not pretty, and so it definitely was a gimmick, but it proved its worth. The Nintendo DS at the time was claimed to be a sort of third pillar of Nintendo instead of being a direct successor to the Game Boy Advance, even though 100% was a direct successor to the Game Boy Advance, because it had a Game Boy Advance slot and they called it backwards compatible, and you wouldn't call a console backwards compatible if it wasn't a direct successor. Nintendo was really only doing this to save their own asses in case the DS just failed, but it didn't flop, and they managed to actually make a decent bit of money off this thing, and so, well, out with the old and in with the new, and the DS became the new handheld of the era. The DS proved that Nintendo's gimmicks could work well. However, handhelds weren't the only place where gimmicks managed to shine. No, there was another place where gimmicks ran wild, and that was in the home consoles. Well, home consoles up to a point. You see, for the first, like, 5 generations, 6 of home consoles, well, there wasn't really any gimmicks per se. Gimmicks weren't really a big thing for a lot of the generations of home consoles. And for the first 6, well, there wasn't any. You see, for the first 6 generations of consoles, there wasn't really that much gimmick stuff going around. There were improvements, yeah, while there are certain gimmicks that you could call gimmicks if you stretch the definition of the word a bit, they weren't really gimmicks. Like, you could say the N64's idea of 3D gaming was a gimmick, but realistically it was the natural progression of where the games market was gonna head to. You had 2D games that looked bad, then you got to 2D games that looked pretty good. They got to 2D games that actually looked decent. And then after that, well, what'd you go? Well, we've got 2D, might as well change that and just upgrade that number there. And so that was a pretty natural next step. But something like making a console with 2 screens, that wasn't very natural. That was something that was innovative, that was new, that was creative. And so home consoles didn't really get that until the 7th generation with Nintendo. You see, Nintendo, well, they were riding off of a pretty lousy console, the Nintendo GameCube. A lot of people look back on the GameCube fondly and remember as a console with a lot of good games and a pretty good time. And Nintendo looks back on it as, yeah, we probably shouldn't repeat that one again. You see, the GameCube was actually kind of a flop for Nintendo. It only sold 21 million units compared to something like the PS2, which sold 160 million units and still the best-selling console to date. It sold the most units out of any console literally ever, so Nintendo got absolutely destroyed that generation. And Nintendo wasn't willing to take any sort of risks here, except for all of them. You see, Nintendo decided, well, they might as well go all or nothing. And they made the Nintendo Wii. What was the gimmick of the Wii? This was the gimmick of the Wii. The Nintendo Wii Remote and, well, motion controls. Now, motion controls have been fairly controversial over the years. You see, a lot of people think they enhance gameplay and a lot of people want them to die. However, motion controls were first fully introduced by Nintendo here, and while to a certain extent they kind of existed before this, they were truly invented in their modern form by Nintendo with the Wii. You see, Nintendo decided they were going to completely capture the casual gaming market. Anyone from your uncles to your 5-year-old kids to your 99-year-old grandmothers, all of them could play on this console. And the game to go with this was, well, Wii Sports. Wii Sports was they basically made to exemplify the gimmick of the Wii, which was the motion controls. You see, with the Wii remote, you could swing it around in multiple different ways and get it to do different things on the actual console. Being able to physically move the Wii remote to replicate an action in-game made it a lot easier for some people, because while knowing that you have to press the A button to jump wasn't always intuitive to someone who'd never played a game before, knowing to just throw a bowling ball or knowing how to use a tennis racket, well, a lot of people already know how to do that. And so the Wii's motion controls on games like Wii Sports actually worked pretty well. And on other games, they sucked! On games like The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword, it was well known about how bad the Wii's motion controls were. You see, being able to control your character holding a sword, well, it just didn't work very well. Having to control the sword individually with the remote, it just doesn't translate very well. Or at the very least for some games it didn't. For some games, holding certain objects worked really well, and for other games, they just weren't designed around the idea of a Wii remote. Some games just shouldn't have had a Wii remote to be used for gameplay. The Wii was also the first console that was truly designed as a true family console. Well, before other consoles, they were, family consoles. The Wii, it was truly a family console. The Wii was the console that added Mii's to Nintendo. Something that, well, you'd make one for every single member of your family. You'd make a Mii for uncle, for your grandpa, for your kids, for yourself, for your wife, everyone. And then they could all have their own individual profiles on games and play. A great example of the Wii being specifically a family console is Mario Kart Wii. You see, all Mario Kart games on every Nintendo console actually just ever have had a single profile and a single save profile where you've got one block of save data. However, on the Wii, you had 4 Mario Kart Wii licenses, which meant you had 4 save games. So you could have 4 different people on their 4 different save states, which just kind of shows how it's supposed to be a family console. You can have 4 different people playing on their different versions of Mario Kart Wii. It's supposed to be a family console. Multiple people are supposed to use it. Because of this, the Wii shot up in success. Anyone was able to understand it, and a lot of people wanted it. Anyone from really old people to really young people. It was intuitive to all, and it was a fun console. It had good games on it as well, which really does improve everything on it. Being able to have good games on the console obviously is going to encourage more people to buy it. Games like Wii Sports or Mario Kart Wii or even something like Smash Bros. Brawl, which, while considered the worst of the Smash Bros, is still a good game. They all were relatively good games to incentivize people to try and buy a Wii. And we knew this was true because the Wiis went out of stock instantly. Like, seriously, during the time when these things were around and still being produced, like, you could not find one of these. Being able to buy a Wii at the time, it was worse than when the PS5 released in modern day. The PS5 released and a lot of people were trying to buy those, and, well, it was really difficult to get one. The Wii was even worse at the time. Everyone wanted one of these because it appealed to everyone. And so because of this, getting a Wii at the time was a to do. However, the Nintendo Wii's gimmick of motion controls, how it actually turn out depends who you ask. You see, motion controls in a lot of games were used very well and a lot of other games used very poorly. And because of that, well, a lot of people don't have the fondest memories of motion controls and other people thought they were really cool. Motion controls in general, in my opinion, I think are really good, but only when used right. Motion controls for something like a sports game where you are throwing around a racket or throwing a ball or something, I think is really good. Motion controls in Zelda, ew! However, in general, I think motion controls as a gimmick, they prove their worth. Especially considering that they're in today, and well, at the time, it wasn't just Nintendo that was trying this. You see, at the time, there was another console manufacturer who was using their binoculars to look over at what Nintendo was doing and thought, hey, we should also do that. Microsoft and the Xbox Kinects. The Kinects is like the poor man's Wii remote. The Kinect is basically supposed to be a better version of the Wii. So instead of having to hold a lousy Wii remote, you'd connect with essentially a camera to your Xbox. The camera would just track your body movements and you wouldn't even have to hold a controller. This failed miserably. You see, while the Kinect did okay at the very beginning of its lifespan, it fell off dramatically when Xbox just couldn't care enough to put out a lot of games for it. There weren't a lot of games for Kinects, and not ones that were interesting at least. And one of the reasons Nintendo was able to be successful with the Wii is because, well, motion controls were kind of built into the thing. Kinects was just a little add-on thing you could have. You didn't need it to have an Xbox. Or the motion controls were built into the Wii, and, well, you've got that built into the console, so you have to use them. And additionally, the fact that the console actually has good games on it that actually occasionally use the motion controls really well, yeah, people were just gonna buy a Wii. If they want to use motion controls, they're just gonna use a Wii remote rather than just flailing their arms around, because the Wii remote is still more intuitive than it. However, the idea for Kinects isn't the worst. I get where Microsoft was coming from. The idea of being able to just move around with your body to do what you want in the game, it's interesting, but it never really took off with the Xbox. And while in a modern sense, Kinects kind of exists to a certain extent with things like VR and body trackers and all, Kinect itself never took off in the way that Microsoft wanted it to. And so as a gimmick, the idea of a camera looking at your body and tracking your movements to put that into the game just wasn't ever really something that went on as other things did. There is, however, one last little gimmick I'd like to talk about today. One that I think, it's pretty good now that I look on it, and it can't actually be that bad, and oh my goodness! The Nintendo 3DS. 3D on a console. Now, the 3DS was not the first console to do this, mind you. As I said earlier, the Virtual Boy attempted VR sometime in the 90s, and, well, it was the Virtual Boy. The Virtual Boy attempted VR in the 90s and failed terribly at it, absolutely miserably. And, well, VR was a form of 3D. And, fun fact, Nintendo wanted to add stereoscopic 3D to the GameCube as well. They wanted to add a screen attachment that would have 3D so you could play GameCube games in 3D, and some GameCube games have some native support for 3D. But Nintendo was never able to fully get 3D to work. Some other companies had done 3D before, but every single time you'd have to wear glasses for the 3D effect to work. You'd either have to wear 3D shutter glasses that would constantly flick up and down to get to see different frames at different times, or you have to wear those blue and red movie 3D glasses that were just kind of tacky. What Nintendo decided to do was skip the goggles and the glasses and the add-ons and just build the 3D directly into the console. By taking a Nintendo DS and then hammering 3D into it, Nintendo managed to create the Nintendo 3DS. The 3DS had the feature being able to turn on stereoscopic 3D on the top screen, and basically no one actually used this. The 3D was cool as a gimmick. Next, please. No one wanted to really use the 3D. People kind of bought a 3DS, used the 3D for the first 10 minutes of it, thought, oh, that's pretty cool, but that's burning my eyes, I'm turning it off. 3D wasn't a great hit, but the console was. 3DS itself was fine as a console. It had decent games, it had a decent control scheme, it was decently powerful. But the 3D itself as a gimmick, nah. The 3D gimmick with the 3DS just it was just kind of there. It worked okay, and that's about it. You had to look at the 3DS from a very specific angle, pretty much head on, or otherwise it wouldn't work. And in later models of the 3DS, they would fix this. In the new Nintendo 3DS line, they would fix this by having the 3D be able to track where you're actually looking at the 3DS from, and it would adjust itself accordingly. So you actually didn't have to keep your head completely straight on and still in order to see the 3DS's 3D correctly. It still wasn't very good though, and it still hurt a lot of people's eyes. Children particularly. You see, Nintendo actually got a lot of complaints from people of, well, the 3D hurting their kids' eyes, to the point Nintendo released the 2DS, which just removed the 3D from the console entirely. So the 3D feature, yeah, it was okay, but it wasn't really the best. The 3DS was a good handheld. The 3D gimmick, kind of. However, in the end, are gimmicks even that good in consoles? I mean, let's look back on the gimmicks that we've looked over today. I mean, some gimmicks are pretty good. They're sort of a beta test for things that would come in future. Something like the Game Boy Light kind of set as a beta for Nintendo's later consoles, and while they didn't immediately move over to backlit screens, with the SP, they definitely did, and well, a lot of that would have been taken from the Game Boy Light. A lot of the things they managed to do with the Game Boy SP, the Game Boy Light would have helped with that. So some of these consoles acted as beta tests and predecessors to future ones, acting as a sort of what is to come of newer consoles. Some gimmick features, while never really replicated again, maybe once over, they were really good. So I feel like the DS with an interactive bottom touchscreen. Well, Nintendo would later make the 3DS and I guess the Wii U you could count to an extent. After those two, they never really continued with the dual screen mechanic. This was mainly because the Wii U was a bit of a flop, and so the dual screen mechanic wasn't really something they were willing to continue with. However, the DS, that doesn't mean it was a bad console or dual screen was even that bad of an idea. It worked pretty well. Then you've got consoles like the Wii, which created motion control, something that is still heavily debated today. A lot of people love them, a lot of people hate them. Personally, I don't really care. I think sometimes they can be used really well. I think other times they make the game absolutely However, is it really that bad? Then you've got companies like Xbox and Microsoft attempting to recreate the Wii and failing miserably with the Kinects. They had the idea, but the lack of games for the console and the fact that it was an add-on that not many people even knew what it was or that it existed kind of caused it to never take off fully. And even after that, you got gimmicks like 3D on the 3DS, which, while weren't the best gimmick ever, the console still sold well, proving that, well, gimmicks can kind of be there. They don't have to ruin the console experience. They can kind of just be an extra. So, in conclusion, I think in general, gimmicks are good. Gimmicks are proof that the gaming industry is moving towards being innovative. I think as of recently, the lack of gimmicks in consoles has kind of proven that a lot of people are bored of the staleness of just normal consoles. People were getting bored of the gimmicks, don't get me wrong, there was too many of them. But now we've gone back to just stale consoles without anything interesting to them. And I think that's a bit of a shame. The Nintendo Switch 2 is really the only console with some sort of a gimmick. And the console switching gimmick has proven to be so useful that it's barely even a gimmick at this point, and more of an actual dedicated, really useful feature. So I think in general, gimmicks are good, and I think they should be brought back. Maybe not to the extent they were before, but more companies should be willing to experiment with their consoles. Being able to innovate will find the next big thing and possibly something that's even useful for games. However, in the end, that's pretty much it. So I guess all that's left is final verdict? You know, I've never actually tried to put 4 DSs together. I wonder what would happen then.